The dust of Willow Creek's main street swirled under the boots of Jacob Harrow as he stood, hat clutched in his calloused hands, facing the scorn of the townsfolk. The noonday sun burned high above the Colorado town, its rays glinting off the polished badge of Sheriff Amos Tate, who stood at the head of the gathered crowd. Just hours earlier, Jacob had fought to save a young woman from a brutal fate, his knuckles still raw and bloodied from the struggle. But now, in the heart of the town square, he was no hero. The people of Willow Creek, faces twisted with righteous fury, branded him a villain. "You had no right, Harrow," Sheriff Tate declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "No right to take the law into your own hands." The badge on his chest caught the sunlight, a stark reminder of his authority. The townsfolk nodded, their whispers growing louder, their judgment as heavy as the stones they might have thrown. Jacob's gaze drifted past the sheriff to the steps of the whitewashed church, where Clara Hensley sat, her green dress pristine, her auburn hair tied back in a neat braid. She was young, perhaps 21, with eyes like the clear waters of the creek that gave the town its name. Those same eyes had been wide with terror at dawn, when 3 outlaws had pinned her against the wall of Harper's feed store, their intentions dark and unmistakable. Jacob had been passing by, headed to check his traps, when her stifled cry reached his ears. He hadn't hesitated. "They were set to hurt her," Jacob said, his voice low but steady, carrying across the square. "I did what any man with a shred of decency would do." Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, a widow whose sharp tongue was as feared as her late husband's rifle, pushed forward, her walking stick tapping against the wooden boardwalk. "Decency," she spat, her eyes narrowing. "You beat those men senseless, Harrow. And for what? To ruin that poor girl's reputation." She pointed her stick at Clara, who sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "A young woman alone with a man like you at dawn? What will folks say?" The words landed like a blow. Jacob, a widower himself, had fought in the Civil War, buried his wife to fever, and carved out a modest ranch on the edge of Willow Creek with nothing but grit and sweat. He'd seen death, faced Comanche raids, and rebuilt his life from ashes. Yet standing there, with the town's eyes boring into him, he felt smaller than ever. The crowd pressed closer, their murmurs turning to shouts. "Troublemaker," one voice called. "We don't need your kind here," another echoed. What none of them knew they couldn't possibly know was that Clara Hensley carried a secret that would turn their world upside down. In less than a day, the same people now cursing Jacob Harrow would be on their knees, begging his forgiveness. Clara stood slowly from the church steps, smoothing her dress, her eyes locking with Jacob's. There was no shame in her gaze, no fear, only a flicker of something fierce, something that promised a reckoning. The first stone flew, missing Jacob's head by inches and thudding against the church wall. A rotten apple followed, splattering on his shoulder. The crowd's anger had turned feral, their shouts a chorus of condemnation. "Get out of Willow Creek," Mayor Leonard Baxter bellowed, his florid face glistening with sweat. "We don't want your kind of justice here." Jacob wiped the apple's juice from his coat, his jaw tight. He'd faced Confederate volleys at Antietam, stared down rustlers who'd tried to steal his cattle, but nothing had prepared him for this being torn apart by the very community he'd called home for a decade. Clara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos like a bell. "Stop it," she cried, her tone sharp and clear. "Mr. Harrow saved my life. Those men had knives. They meant to." "Hush, child," Mrs. Grayson interrupted, waving her stick. "You're in shock. You don't know what you're saying." "They meant to kill me," Clara insisted, stepping closer to Jacob. The crowd faltered, her words momentarily silencing their rage. But Sheriff Tate spat into the dirt, his eyes narrowing. "Convenient, isn't it? Harrow just happens to be lurking behind the feed store at dawn. Maybe he was in on it. Maybe this was all a setup." The accusation hit Jacob like a bullet. His fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay still. Fighting now would only fuel their narrative. "That's a lie," he said, his voice rough with restrained anger. Language. Reverend Samuel Holt emerged from the church, his black coat flapping in the breeze. "This is precisely the sort of man we're dealing with, crude, violent, godless." Young Caleb Reed, barely 15, stepped forward, egged on by the older men. "My pa says men like you prey on innocent women," he said, his voice trembling with bravado. He hurled a stone, which struck Jacob's arm. The pain was nothing compared to the sting of betrayal. Jacob took a step forward, and the crowd flinched, sensing the war-hardened strength in his frame. For a moment, the soldier he'd been, the man who'd killed to survive, flashed in his eyes. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Bled for it, lost my kin for it, and this is how you repay me." But their faces were closed, their minds made up. He was the villain in their story, and no words would sway them. What they didn't see was the faint smile on Clara's lips, or the way her fingers brushed against something hidden in the folds of her dress's secret. That would bring the wrath of heaven and earth to Willow Creek. By morning, their righteous indignation would turn to trembling fear, and Jacob Harrow would stand taller than ever. Jacob sat alone in the dim light of O'Malley's Tavern, the only place in Willow Creek that hadn't turned him away. The bartender, One-Eyed Jack, slid a glass of whiskey across the counter, his single eye glinting with pity. "Heard they're forming a council tonight," Jack muttered, wiping a glass with a rag that had seen better days. "Gonna decide what to do with you." Jacob downed the whiskey, the burn steadying his nerves. He'd done right, saved a girl from a fate no woman should endure, and yet he was the one branded a monster. The outlaws he'd fought had slipped out of town before sunrise, leaving no trace. Convenient, he thought, his mind turning over the events of the morning. The tavern door creaked open, and Sheriff Tate strode in, followed by Mayor Baxter and two councilmen, their faces grim. "Harrow," Tate said, his hand resting on his revolver. "Town council's decided. You're not welcome here no more. You got till sundown to clear out." Jacob stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is America, Sheriff. A man's got a right to live where he chooses, not when he's a danger to decent folk." Baxter snapped, his chins quivering. "That girl's reputation is ruined because of you. Her marriage prospects, her standing in this town'll gone. Her reputation." Jacob's laugh was bitter. "3 men were set to violate and murder her, and you're worried about her reputation?" Councilman Ezra Pike, a weary man with a twitching mustache, stepped forward. "She says you saved her, sure, but folks saw you alone with her behind the store, in the dark, for nigh on an hour. What were you doing all that time, Harrow?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Jacob's face flushed with anger. "I was making sure she was safe, making sure those bastards didn't come back." "Watch your tongue," Tate growled. "You're only proving our point." One-Eyed Jack coughed nervously. "Maybe you gents take this outside. Don't need trouble in here." But trouble had already found them. Through the tavern's grimy windows, Jacob saw a crowd gathering in the streetmen, women, even children, staring at the tavern like it was a den of vipers. Clara stood among them, her auburn hair glowing in the afternoon sun. Unlike the others, she wasn't glaring with hatred. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone. "You got 1 hour," Tate said, adjusting his gun belt. 1 hour to pack up and get out of Willow Creek. Don't make us force you." As the men filed out, Jacob caught Clara's gaze through the window. Her smile wasn't the timid gratitude of a rescued girl, it was sharp, knowing, and promised a storm was coming to Willow Creek. The telegraph office was a small, dusty room at the edge of town, its single window overlooking the rolling plains. Clara Hensley stepped inside at 3 p.m., her green dress brushing the floorboards. Old Nathaniel Burke, the telegraph operator, looked up from his machine, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Miss Hensley, after this morning, you ought to be resting." She placed a gold coin on the counter, more money than Nathaniel earned in a month. "I need to send a message. Urgent priority." Nathaniel's eyes widened as he read the address she handed him. General Elias Hensley, Fort Carson, Colorado. "Hensley," he stammered. "You're kin to General Elias Hensley." Clara's smile was cold and precise. "He's my father." Nathaniel's hands shook as he adjusted his spectacles. General Elias Hensley was a name that carried weight across the Rockies. He commanded the Colorado Military District, with 2,500 cavalry under his control and the governor's trust. Men who crossed him didn't just lose their standing, they vanished into the mountains, never to be seen again. "The message, Mr. Burke," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. Nathaniel prepared the telegraph key, his fingers trembling as he transcribed her words. Attempted assault stopped by local rancher. Town persecuting hero. Require immediate escort. Arrive tomorrow dawn. Clara. As the message clicked through the wires, Clara turned to the window. Across the street, Jacob Harrow was loading a battered wagon with his few possessions. The sight stirred something in her Gwilt, perhaps, or something deeper. Miss Hensley, Nathaniel whispered, "Does your father know you're in Willow Creek?" "He knows exactly where I am," she replied, her eyes never leaving Jacob. "And after today, he'll know exactly how his daughter was treated by this town." The truth was more tangled than anyone suspected. Clara hadn't been passing through Willow Creek by chance. She'd been hiding, fleeing an arranged marriage to a ruthless mining magnate named Victor Slade, a man her father had chosen to secure political alliances. The attack by the outlaws had been real, their knives gleaming in the dawn light. But her presence in Willow Creek was deliberate. For a week, she'd worked as a seamstress at Mrs. Grayson's shop, blending into the town's rhythm, hoping to vanish into its anonymity. But when those men cornered her, when Jacob Harrow fought like a lion to save her, everything changed. The town's cruelty toward her savior had given her a weapon to wield against her father's plans and against Willow Creek itself. Through the window, she saw Mayor Baxter approach Jacob, his posture smug as he likely delivered another ultimatum. Neither man noticed the faint dust cloud on the horizon, small but growing steadily larger. "Mr. Burke," Clara said, her voice sweet but edged with steel, "you should know something else. My father doesn't take kindly to those who harm his family, and he especially despises those who punish good men for doing what's right." Nathaniel dropped his pencil, his face pale. "If you were Clara," he whispered, "what would you do? Tell the town who you are now and risk losing your leverage, or let them dig their own grave?" Clara's smile widened. "I choose silence," she said, sealing Willow Creek's fate. By 4 p.m., the town was ablaze with whispers. Nathaniel Burke, despite Clara's veiled warning, couldn't keep the secret. He told his wife, who told her cousin, who told the Reverend sister, who ran to Mayor Baxter. "General Hensley's daughter," Baxter repeated, his voice trembling. "Are you sure?" Mrs. Holt nodded, her bonnet shaking. "Nathaniel swears it's true. She sent a telegram to Fort Carson herself. The way she spoke, "O Lord, help us." Baxter stumbled back, his face ashen. General Elias Hensley was a legend in Colorado, a man who'd crushed Ute rebellions, hanged bandits without trial, and raised entire outposts for defying his orders. And they'd spent the morning humiliating the man who'd saved his daughter's life. Meanwhile, Jacob Harrow finished loading his wagon, unaware that his exile was about to become his redemption. He checked the harness on his old mare, his possessions, a rifle, a few clothes, a locket with his late wife's picture stacked neatly in the back. Leaving so soon, Clara's voice broke his thoughts. She stood nearby, her hands behind her back, her beauty even more striking up close. "Town's made its feelings clear," Jacob said, his voice heavy. "Best I move on. Best for everyone." She tilted her head, studying him. "Mr. Harrow, do you know who I am?" "A lady who needed help," he said simply. That's all that mattered. Her expression flickered surprise, or perhaps something softer. "And if I told you helping me might bring trouble?" "Big trouble?" Jacob climbed onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. "Already got trouble, miss, but I'd do it again. Some things matter more than a man's good name." Clara's gaze was unreadable. "My father's coming, Mr. Harrow. He'll be here by dawn. General Elias Hensley, Colorado Military District. He doesn't take kindly to those who harm his kin. And after today, he'll hold this whole town guilty." Jacob's blood ran cold. He'd heard of Hensley stories of massacres, of towns reduced to ash for lesser offenses. "Why tell me this?" She stepped closer, her voice a whisper. "Because in a few hours, this town will realize what they've done. And when they do, they'll beg you to save them again." The distant sound of hoof beats grew louder, faint but unmistakable. Clara's smile was no longer soft. It was the smile of a woman who held the power to reshape destinies, and she was ready to unleash it. As the sun dipped below the Colorado horizon, casting long shadows across Willow Creek's dusty streets. The town buzzed with a nervous energy that hadn't been felt since the Ute raids of '63. The revelation of Clara Hensley's identity had spread like a prairie fire, and with it came the chilling certainty that General Elias Hensley's wrath was riding toward them. Jacob Harrow, exiled just hours ago, was now the linchpin of their salvation, though he didn't know it yet. The townsfolk who had spat on him, thrown stones, and branded him a villain were beginning to grasp the weight of their mistake. But time was running out, and the dust cloud on the horizon was no longer a distant smudgite, it was a storm of hoofbeats, carrying judgment in its wake. In the fading light, Jacob guided his wagon along the rocky trail north toward Boulder, his mare plodding steadily under the weight of his meager belongings. The locket with his late wife's picture swung gently from the wagon seat, a reminder of the life he'd tried to rebuild in Willow Creek. He'd come to the town a decade ago, a war-weary veteran seeking peace, and had carved out a ranch with his own hands. Now that life was behind him, scattered like the dust under his wheels. Clara's words echoed in his mind. In a few hours, this town will realize what they've done, and when they do, they'll beg you to save them again. He didn't know what she meant, but the name General Elias Hensley carried a weight that made his stomach churn. He'd heard the story of entire settlements burned, men strung up for lesser offenses than humiliating a hero. Jacob shook his head, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the faint thunder of hooves in the distance kept pulling his thoughts back to Willow Creek. Back in town, the council chamber was a scene of barely controlled chaos. Mayor Leonard Baxter paced the creaking floorboards, his nightshirt hastily replaced with a rumpled suit, his face slick with sweat despite the evening chill. Sheriff Amos Tate leaned against the wall, his badge glinting dully in the lamplight, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous twitch. Reverend Samuel Holt clutched his Bible, murmuring prayers, while Mrs. Eleanor Grayson sat ramrod straight, her walking stick tapping an impatient rhythm. The other council members, Ezra Pike, Martha Dennison, and old Nathaniel Burke, sat around the oak table, their faces pale as they grappled with the reality of their situation. "We didn't know she was General Hensley's daughter," Baxter stammered, his voice breaking. "If we'd known, we'd never have." "Never have what, Mrs.?" Grayson snapped, her eyes blazing. "Spit on the man who saved her. Run him out of town like a common thief. You led the charge, Leonard, with your sanctimonious speeches about propriety." Baxter's jowls quivered. "We thought we were protecting Clara's reputation. A young woman alone with a man at Donwit, were we supposed to think?" "You were supposed to think," Martha Dennison said quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. As the town's schoolteacher, her voice carried a calm authority that cut through the room's panic. "You were supposed to ask questions, to listen to Clara, to trust a man who's lived among us for 10 years without so much as a harsh word." Sheriff Tate spat into a spittoon, the sound sharp in the tense silence. "Harrow's no saint. He beat those outlaws to a pulp. Who's to say he wasn't part of their scheme? Skulking around at dawn, just in time to play the hero?" Reverend Holt looked up from his Bible, his face drawn. "Amos, you know that's nonsense. Jacob Harrow fought for the Union, lost his wife, built a life here. He's no conspirator. We let our pride and our fear of scandal blind us. And now we're going to pay for it," Nathaniel Burke muttered, his spectacles fogging with nervous sweat. "General Hensley doesn't forgive. I sent that telegram myself. He'll be here by dawn, and he'll bring hell with him." The room fell silent, the weight of Nathaniel's words settling over them like a shroud. General Elias Hensley was a legend in Colorado, a man who'd crushed rebellions, hunted outlaws, and turned defiance into dust. The story of Blackwater Canyon, where he'd burned a rustler camp to the ground for stealing a single horse, was whispered in every saloon from Denver to Durango. And now, Willow Creek had humiliated the man who'd saved his daughter. "We have to find Harrow," Baxter said, his voice rising with desperation. "Bring him back. Make this right before the general arrives." "And how do you propose we do that, Mrs.?" Grayson asked, her tone sharp. "You drove him out. He could be halfway to Boulder by now." "Then we ride," Tate said, straightening. "We send out search parties, scour the trails. We find him and bring him back with an apology." Martha Dennison shook her head. "An apology won't be enough. If General Hensley sees us groveling, he'll know we're scared. We need to show him we've changed, that we honor Jacob for what he did." "And what about Clara?" Ezra Pike asked, his mustache twitching. "She's the one who sent the telegram. She's been playing us like a fiddle, hasn't she? Hiding who she is, letting us dig our own graves." "Don't you dare blame her, Mrs." Grayson said, her stick slamming against the floor. "She was attacked, nearly killed. If she didn't tell us who her father was, maybe it's because she didn't trust us to do right by her. And we proved her right, didn't we?" The argument erupted, voices overlapping in a cacophony of blame and fear. Outside, the townsfolk gathered in the square, their whispers carrying on the evening breeze. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, sensing the tension. Men checked their rifles, as if steel could protect them from what was coming. Clara stood apart, near the church, her green dress a stark contrast to the gathering dusk. She watched the horizon, her hand resting on the hidden object beneath her dress, a locket, perhaps, or something more dangerous. Her silence was a weapon, and she wielded it with precision. By 8 p.m., the search parties were organized. Sheriff Tate led the first group, a dozen men on horseback, their lanterns casting flickering shadows as they rode north toward the Boulder Trail. Mayor Baxter took another group east, toward the old mining roads, while Ezra Pike and a handful of volunteers headed west. The women of Willow Creek, led by Martha Dennison, stayed behind to prepare the town square for what they hoped would be a reconciliation. They swept the dirt, hung lanterns, and set up tables with food and drink, a gesture of goodwill, however feeble it might seem in the face of General Hensley's wrath. Clara watched the preparations from the church steps, her expression unreadable. "Mrs." Grayson approached, her stick tapping slower now, as if the day's events had sapped her strength. "Miss Hensley," she said, her voice softer than it had been that morning, "I owe you an apology. I spoke out of turn, judged quickly. I didn't know who you were." Clara's eyes met hers, cool and steady. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat Mr. Harrow with respect. He saved my life, and you called him a villain for it." "Mrs." Grayson flinched, her gnarled hands tightening on her stick. "We were wrong. I was wrong. But please, tell me, what can we do to make this right?" Clara's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the dust cloud was now visible even in the twilight, a dark smudge against the stars. "My father will decide what's right," she said. "He always does, Mrs." Grayson followed her gaze, her face paling. "And Mr. Harrow, do you think he'll forgive us?" Clara's smile was faint, almost wistful. "Mr. Harrow has a good heart, but whether he'll forgive you depends on how deep your regret runs." As Mrs. Grayson shuffled away, Clara's thoughts turned to the secret she carried. Her flight from Victor Slade, the mining magnate her father had chosen, wasn't just a rebellion against an unwanted marriage. Slade was a man of cruelty, his wealth built on the backs of broken miners, his influence a web that stretched from Denver's boardrooms to Washington's halls. Clara had fled to Willow Creek not just to escape him, but to find a way to break his hold over her father's ambitions. The attack by the outlaws had been a brutal twist of fate, but Jacob Harrow's intervention had given her a new path. By saving her, he'd handed her the leverage she needed to unravel her father's plans and to punish a town that had shown its true colors. The sound of hooves grew louder, a steady drumbeat that set the town's nerves on edge. Clara's hand brushed the hidden object beneath her dress again, her fingers tracing its outline. It wasn't a locket, but a letter written in her own hand, addressed to a federal marshal in Denver. The letter detailed Victor Slade's crimes, bribery, extortion, the deaths of miners buried in accidents to hide his greed. She'd planned to send it from Willow Creek, but the attack had delayed her. Now, with her father's cavalry on the way, she had a choice: reveal the letter and expose Slade, risking her father's wrath, or let Willow Creek face the consequences of their actions first. She chose silence for now, but the weight of her decision pressed heavily on her heart. Jacob's wagon creaked along the trail, the stars overhead a cold reminder of his isolation. He'd traveled this road before, after the war, when he'd wandered from town to town, searching for a place to belong. Willow Creek had been that place until today. Now he was a man without a home again, his future as uncertain as the shadows cast by his lantern. The distant hoof beats he'd heard earlier were closer now, a rhythmic thud that seemed to come from all directions. He reined in his mare, his hand resting on the rifle across his lap. Outlaws, rustlers, or something worse? The answer came in the form of lantern light bobbing in the darkness. Sheriff Tate's voice called out, rough but lacking its usual arrogance. Harrow. Jacob Harrow, hold up. Jacob tensed, his grip tightening on the rifle. What do you want, Tate? Come to make sure I'm gone? Tate rode into view, his posse behind him, their faces grim in the lantern glow. We need you to come back, Jacob. There's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Jacob's laugh was harsh. You called me a predator, ran me out of town, and now you want me back? What's changed? Tate shifted in his saddle, his eyes avoiding Jacob's. We didn't know who she was. Clara Hensley's General Elias Hensley's daughter. He's coming to Willow Creek, and he's not happy. Not with us, not with what we did to you. Jacob's blood ran cold, Clara's warning suddenly making sense. And you think bringing me back will save your hides? It's more than that, Tate said, his voice low. We were wrong, Jacob. I was wrong. You saved that girl, and we punished you for it. Come back, let us make it right. Jacob studied the sheriff's face, searching for deceit. He saw none, only fear and a flicker of shame. The other men, farmers, shopkeepers, men he'd known for years, nodded in agreement, their hats in their hands. What's the general planning to do? Jacob asked. Tate swallowed hard. He's bringing cavalry. 200 men, maybe more. If we don't show him we've made amends, there's no telling what he'll do. You know the stories. Jacob did know. He'd heard of Hensley's justice swift, brutal, and unforgiving. Part of him wanted to ride on, to let Willow Creek reap what it had sown. But another part, the part that had fought for his country and buried his wife, couldn't turn away. I'll come back, he said finally. But not for you. For Clara. She deserves to know her sacrifice wasn't for nothing. The ride back to Willow Creek was silent, the men riding in a loose formation round Jacob's wagon. The stars wheeled overhead, and the hoof beats in the distance grew louder. A reminder that time was slipping away. Jacob's thoughts were a tangle of anger, betrayal, and something else, hope, perhaps. That Clara's faith in him wasn't misplaced. By midnight, Willow Creek was a town transformed. The square was alight with lanterns, tables laden with food and drink. A makeshift stage erected near the church. The townsfolk worked feverishly, driven by fear and guilt, to prepare for Jacob's return. Martha Dennison directed the women in arranging flowers, while Mrs. Grayson, her earlier venom gone, helped hang bunting. Even young Caleb Reed, who'd thrown stones at Jacob, worked alongside his father, his face red with shame. Clara stood at the edge of the square, watching the preparations with a mix of satisfaction and unease. Her plan had worked. Her silence had forced the town to confront their wrongs, but the letter in her dress weighed heavier now. If her father arrived and learned of her flight from Victor Slade, he might see her actions as defiance, not strategy. And if he discovered the letter, her accusations against Slade could unravel his political alliances. She'd wanted to save herself and expose a monster, but now she risked destroying a town and the man who'd saved her. Reverend Holt approached, his Bible still in hand. Miss Hensley, I must speak with you. What we did to Mr. Harrow was a sin, and I bear the weight of it. But your father, what will he demand of us? Clara's eyes were steady. He'll demand justice, Reverend. What that looks like depends on what you do before he arrives. And you, Holt pressed, why didn't you tell us who you were? Why let us believe you were just a seamstress? Because I wanted to see who you really were, Clara said. And you showed me. Holt bowed his head, his shoulders sagging. We'll make it right. For you, for Mr. Harrow, for the Lord's mercy. As he walked away, Clara's gaze returned to the horizon. The dust cloud was closer now, a dark wave under the starlight. Her father was coming, and with him, the reckoning she'd set in motion. Whether it would save Willow Creek or destroy it depended on the next few hours, and on Jacob Harrow's willingness to forgive a town that didn't deserve it. The first rays of dawn broke over Willow Creek as Jacob's wagon rolled into the square. Flanked by Tate's posse, the townsfolk stood in a silent semicircle, their faces a mix of guilt, fear, and tentative hope. The tables were laden with bread, pies, and cider, the bunting fluttering in the morning breeze. It was a scene of contrition, but Jacob's heart was heavy. He'd fought for these people, shared their harvests, mourned their losses. And now they stood before him, not as neighbors, but as penitents. Mayor Baxter stepped forward, his head in his hands. "Mr. Harrow, we've done you a great wrong. We judged you without cause, punished you for your courage. We beg your forgiveness." Jacob dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He looked at the faces around himers. Grayson, her eyes downcast. Caleb Reed, clutching his cap. Reverend Holt, his Bible trembling in his hands. "You didn't just judge me," he said, his voice steady. "You judged Clara. You made her a victim twice over, first by those outlaws, then by your words." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through them. "Mrs." Grayson stepped forward, her stick silent for once. "You're right, Mr. Harrow. I spoke out of pride, out of fear for what folks might think. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." One by one, others followed. Caleb Reed's voice broke as he apologized for the stones. Martha Dennison spoke of her silence, her failure to stand up sooner. Even Tate, his badge pinned crookedly, offered a gruff apology, his eyes on the ground. Clara watched from the church steps, her heart caught between triumph and sorrow. Jacob's return was a victory, but it was only the beginning. The hoofbeats were now a thunder, shaking the earth. The townsfolk turned as one, their faces paling as the dust cloud resolved into a line of cavalry 200 strong, their sabers gleaming, their horses snorting steam in the cool dawn air. At their head rode General Elias Hensley, his gray hair cropped short, his eyes like flint. His presence was a force, a storm made flesh, and Willow Creek stood in its path. As the first light of dawn painted Willow Creek's main street in hues of gold and crimson, the thunder of hoofbeats shook the earth, heralding the arrival of General Elias Hensley and his cavalry. The townsfolk stood frozen in the square, their makeshift tables of bread and cider forgotten, their lanterns flickering in the morning breeze. Jacob Harrow, newly returned from his brief exile, stood at the center of it all, his weathered face unreadable as he faced the approaching storm. The apologies of Mayor Leonard Baxter, Sheriff Amos Tate, and the others still hung in the air, fragile offerings against the wrath that now crested the hill. Clara Hensley, standing on the church steps, her green dress catching the light, watched her father's approach with a mix of resolve and trepidation. The letter hidden beneath her dress, one detailing Victor Slad's crimes burned against her skin, a secret that could either save or doom them all. Willow Creek's fate hung in the balance, and the next few hours would determine whether it faced redemption or ruin. General Hensley rode at the head of his 200 cavalrymen, a towering figure in a black coat, his gray hair cropped close, his eyes like shards of ice under a heavy brow. His horse, a massive bay stallion, snorted clouds of steam as it halted at the edge of the square. The soldiers behind him formed a perfect line, their sabers gleaming, their rifles held at the ready, their faces as impassive as stone. The general dismounted with the precision of a man who'd spent decades in the saddle, his boots striking the dirt with a sound that echoed like a gavel. The crowd parted instinctively, their murmurs silenced by the weight of his presence. "Where's my daughter?" General Hensley's voice cut through the morning air, sharp and commanding. A cannon shot in the stillness. Clara stepped forward from the church steps, no longer the frightened girl of yesterday, but a woman who carried the weight of her father's name. With quiet strength, she walked to him, her auburn hair glowing in the dawn light, and kissed his cheek. "Hello, Papa," she said, her voice steady despite the eyes of the town upon her. Hensley's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, a father's love breaking through his steel exterior. "Are you hurt, Clara?" he asked, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the square. "No, Papa," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "Thanks to Mr. Jacob Harrow." The general's gaze swept over the townsfolk, a predator sizing up its prey. "I understand," he said, his tone deceptively calm, "that you people saw fit to punish the man who saved my daughter's life, to cast him out like a criminal." Mayor Baxter stepped forward, his suit rumpled from a sleepless night, his hands trembling as he clutched his hat. "General, sir, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. We didn't know Miss Clara was your daughter. We thought—" "You thought?" Hensley's voice was a whipcrack, silencing Baxter mid-sentence. "You thought a young woman's honor was worth less than your gossip? That a man who risked his life to protect her deserved your scorn?" His hand rested on the hilt of his saber, a gesture that sent a ripple of fear through the crowd. Reverend Samuel Holt found his courage, stepping forward with his Bible clutched to his chest. "General Hensley, we acted in haste, concerned for Miss Clara's reputation in our small town. We were wrong, and we've sought to make amends. Mr. Harrow is here, welcomed back with our deepest apologies." Hensley's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to Jacob, who stood tall despite the weight of the past day's ordeal. "Mr. Harrow," the general said, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "Step forward." Jacob approached, his boots steady on the dirt, his hat in his hands. Up close, General Hensley was even more imposing, a man whose presence filled the square like a storm cloud. "General," Jacob said, nodding, "I did what any man would do. No more, no less." Hensley studied him, his eyes searching for weakness and finding none. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, "and in return, these people drove you from your home. Tell me, Mr. Harrow, what justice would you demand for such an injustice?" The question hung heavy in the air, a blade poised to fall. The townsfolk held their breath, their eyes on Jacob. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, her walking stick silent for once, looked at him with something like hope. Young Caleb Reed, who'd thrown stones, stood beside his father, his face pale. Sheriff Tate's hand hovered near his revolver, as if expecting violence. Clara watched from her father's side, her expression unreadable, the letter beneath her dress a silent weight. Jacob took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "I ain't one for vengeance, General," he said, his voice steady, but laced with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much. "These folks made a mistake, a bad one. They judged me without cause, turned their backs when I needed them. But I've seen enough blood in my time in the battlefield, in my own home when I lost my wife. I don't want more of it here. Let them learn from this, and let that be enough." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of relief and shame. Clara's lips curved slightly, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. General Hensley's expression didn't change, but his hand moved away from his saber. "A generous man," he said, "more generous than they deserve. But justice isn't served by mercy alone. This town will answer for what it's done." He turned to his captain, a lean man with a scar across his cheek. "Captain Reynolds, how many men does it take to raise a town this size?" Reynolds didn't hesitate. 30, sir. 40 if we want it done by noon." The crowd gasped, women clutching their children, men stepping back as if distance could save them. Mrs. Grayson's stick slipped from her hand, clattering to the ground. Reverend Holt dropped to his knees, his Bible falling open in the dirt. "Please, General," he begged, his voice breaking. "We've apologized, brought Mr. Harrow back. Surely the Lord teaches forgiveness." "The Lord," Hensley said, his voice cold, "also teaches that you reap what you sow. And what you sowed was cruelty to a man who stood for what was right." Clara stepped forward, her hand brushing her father's arm. "Papa," she said softly, "Mr. Harrow's mercy shows the kind of man he is. Perhaps this town can learn to be better if given the chance." Hensley's eyes flicked to his daughter, a silent question passing between them. Clara's gaze was steady, but her fingers tightened on the hidden letter. She hadn't yet revealed her own secret reason she'd fled to Willow Creek, the letter that could destroy Victor Slade and her father's alliances. For now, she held her silence, letting Jacob's words carry the moment. The general turned back to the crowd. "You have one chance," he said. "Prove to me that this town can honor a hero. Every man, woman, and child who wronged Mr. Harrow will apologize, publicly, here and now, and you will make restitution not just in words, but in deeds. Fail, and my men will ensure Willow Creek is a name forgotten by history." The townsfolk didn't hesitate. Mayor Baxter was the first to step forward, his voice trembling as he faced Jacob. "Mr. Harrow, I led the charge against you, called you a villain when you were a hero. I'm sorry, from the bottom of my heart. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Sheriff Tate followed, unpinning his badge and holding it out to Jacob. "I was wrong to doubt you, Jacob. You're a better man than I'll ever be. If you'll have it, this badge is yours." Jacob shook his head, pushing the badge back. "Keep it, Amos. Just use it better from now on." Mrs. Grayson came next, her eyes wet with tears. "I judged you harshly, Mr. Harrow, and I shamed myself in doing so. Forgive an old woman her pride." She reached out, her hand shaking, and Jacob took it gently, nodding. Young Caleb Reed was last, his voice barely above a whisper. "I threw stones at you, sir. Called you names. I was trying to be tough, but I was wrong. I'm sorry." His father placed a hand on his shoulder, his own eyes red with shame. One by one, the townsfolk came forward, their apologies a litany of regret. Farmers, shopkeepers, mothers, and children all who'd cursed Jacob's name now stood humbled, their voices weaving a tapestry of contrition. Jacob listened to each one, his face a mask of restraint, though his eyes betrayed the weight of their words. Clara watched, her heart swelling with something she couldn't name, pride, perhaps, or something deeper. When the last apology was given, General Hensley nodded, his expression still hard but tempered by a grudging respect. "You've spoken your piece," he said, "but words are cheap. Mr. Harrow, what would you have this town do to prove they've learned their lesson?" Jacob looked at the faces around him, the same faces that had spat on him yesterday. "Build something," he said finally. "A schoolhouse, a hospital, something that makes this town better than it was. And let every man and woman here put their hands to it, so they remember what it means to stand together, not tear each other down." The crowd murmured in agreement, relief washing over them like a tide. Martha Dennison stepped forward, her eyes bright. "We'll do it, Mr. Harrow. A schoolhouse for the children. We'll start today." General Hensley turned to his daughter. "Clara, is this justice enough for you?" Clara hesitated, her hand brushing the letter once more. This was her moment if she revealed it now. She could expose Victor Slade, free herself from the marriage, and shift her father's wrath to a new target. But doing so would mean defying him publicly, risking his anger and the fragile peace she'd helped broker. She looked at Jacob, standing tall despite the scars of yesterday, and made her choice. "It's enough, Papa," she said. "Mr. Harrow's shown us what mercy looks like. Let's show him what redemption can be." Hensley studied her, his eyes narrowing as if sensing the unspoken weight of her words. But he nodded, turning back to the crowd. "You've been given a chance most don't get. Don't waste it." He mounted his horse, his soldiers falling into formation behind him. "Captain Reynolds, we'll camp outside town until the schoolhouse is begun. If these people falter, you know what to do." "Yes, sir," Reynolds said, his scar twitching as he saluted. As the cavalry rode out, the townsfolk exhaled, some weeping openly, others embracing their neighbors. Jacob stood alone for a moment, the weight of the morning settling on his shoulders. Clara approached, her green dress catching the rising sun. "Mr. Harrow," she said, her voice soft but clear, "would you consider staying in Willow Creek? This town needs a man like you." Jacob met her gaze, seeing not just gratitude, but a strength that matched his own. "I reckon I might, Miss Hensley," he said, a faint smile breaking through. "This place is starting to feel like home again." The weeks that followed were a time of transformation for Willow Creek. The townsfolk threw themselves into building the schoolhouse. Their hands blistered, but their spirits lifted by the shared purpose. Jacob worked alongside them, his strength and quiet leadership a reminder of the man they'd nearly lost. Sheriff Tate, humbled by his own failings, became a better lawman, consulting Jacob on matters of justice. Mrs. Grayson, her sharp tongue softened, brought food to the worksite daily, her apologies now in the form of warm bread and stew. Young Caleb Reed followed Jacob like a shadow, eager to learn from the man he'd once wronged. Clara remained in Willow Creek, her presence a quiet force. She worked as a teacher in the temporary school, her skill with children earning the town's respect. But the letter remained unsent, a secret she carried as she navigated her father's expectations. General Hensley visited often, his cavalry a reminder of the debt Willow Creek owed. During one visit, Clara took him aside. her voice steady as she spoke of Victor Slad. Not the full truth, but enough to plant doubts. "He's not a good man, Papa," she said. "I can't marry him." Hensley's face darkened, but he nodded. "We'll talk, Clara, but you'll stay here, where it's safe." 6 months later, Jacob and Clara stood before Reverend Holt in the newly built schoolhouse, their wedding attended by every soul in Willow Creek. The ceremony was simple, the air filled with laughter and music, a celebration of a town reborn. Jacob took the sheriff's badge when Tate retired, serving with a fairness that became legend. The 3 outlaws who'd attacked Clara were never seen again, though rumors spoke of their end in a botched robbery near Colorado Springs. Their bodies left in the dust. Clara eventually sent the letter, not to the marshal, but to a trusted ally of her father's in Denver. Victor Slad's empire crumbled under scrutiny, his crimes exposed without implicating Clara directly. General Hensley, his ambitions tempered by his daughter's resolve, severed ties with Slade, his love for Clara outweighing his political games. Willow Creek became known across Colorado as a town where heroes were honored, where mistakes were met with redemption, not ruin. Jacob and Clara's home, built on the edge of the ranch, was a beacon of hope, their door always open to those in need. And as the years passed, the story of the hero of Willow Creek was told and retold, a reminder that courage and mercy could heal even the deepest wounds. What did you think of Jacob and Clara's story? In the comments, share your thoughts on the themes of violence and injustice. Should Jacob have demanded harsher justice for Willow Creek's betrayal? Or was his mercy the right choice? How would you have handled the town's prejudice if you were in Clara's shoes? Let's discuss your perspective matters.